You've watched 100 versions of him. The cape, the fangs, the castle on the hill. But the real man behind the world's most famous vampire never drank a single drop of blood. He didn't need to. What he actually did was far stranger and far more human than anything Bram Stoker ever wrote. His name was Vlad III, born in 1431 in a small Transylvanian town in what is now Romania. History remembers him by a different name, Vlad the Impaler, not because of fiction, because of what he actually did. Why does a real historical ruler end up reborn as a monster centuries later? The answer says less about Vlad than it does about you, and about how your brain turns fear into story. Vlad grew up as a hostage. That's not an exaggeration. His father, ruler of Wallachia, handed him over to the Ottoman Empire as a teenager to guarantee political loyalty. Vlad spent years locked away in a foreign court, watching how power actually worked. He learned that fear could be a tool. He learned it from the very people holding him captive. When he finally took the throne of Wallachia in 1448, he had already absorbed a brutal lesson. Mercy gets you killed. Cruelty gets you obeyed. So he ruled accordingly. The historian Radu Florescu, who spent decades researching Vlad's life at Boston College, documented something chilling. Vlad didn't impale his enemies randomly. He did it publicly, deliberately. Thousands of wooden stakes, arranged in fields outside his cities, each one holding a body. An Ottoman envoy once described riding for miles through what looked like a forest, only to realize every tree was a corpse. Why would anyone do this on purpose? Because Vlad understood something about human psychology that modern researchers still study today. Fear spreads faster than any army. A single field of impaled bodies could stop an invading force before a single sword was drawn. Vlad wasn't just punishing people. He was building a weapon out of dread itself. Here's the part that surprises most people. Vlad's own subjects, the Wallachian peasants, largely supported him. Stories from the era claim he left a golden cup at a public well, and no one dared steal it. Not because they were pure, because Vlad had made an example of anyone who broke his laws, regardless of rank. Nobles who had betrayed previous rulers found themselves on the same stakes as common thieves. For ordinary people crushed under corrupt boyars, that kind of brutal fairness looked a lot like justice. So how does a ruler who terrified an empire become a vampire 300 years later? The transformation didn't start with Bram Stoker. It started with printing presses. In the late 1400s, German pamphlets began circulating gruesome, exaggerated tales of Vlad's cruelty, often commissioned by his political rivals. These weren't neutral historical records. They were propaganda, designed to paint Vlad as a monster to European audiences who had never met him and never would. Some illustrations even show him eating a meal calmly seated among impaled bodies, a detail almost certainly invented to horrify. This is where your brain starts doing something interesting. Psychologists call it the availability heuristic, a concept studied extensively by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The more vivid and shocking a story is, the more real it feels, even if it's mostly fiction. Vlad's cruelty was real, but the pamphlets stretched it into something closer to myth, and myths are sticky. They spread. They survive. By the time Bram Stoker sat down to write his novel in the 1890s, Vlad the man had already been dead for 4 centuries. Stoker never claimed his vampire was Vlad reincarnated. He borrowed the name Dracula, a title meaning son of the dragon, referencing Vlad's father's membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order sworn to defend Christianity. Stoker liked the name. He liked the geography. He liked the reputation. He built a supernatural monster on the bones of a very real, very human ruler, and the two identities have been fused together ever since. Why did Stoker's version stick so much harder than the historical one? Because Stoker wasn't writing history. He was writing about anxiety. Victorian England was gripped by fears of foreign invasion, disease, and shifting sexual norms. Literary scholar Nina Auerbach, who studied vampire fiction extensively, argued that every generation gets the vampire it needs. Stoker's Dracula wasn't really about Transylvania. He was about what Victorian society was secretly afraid of in itself. That pattern didn't stop with Stoker. Look at any era's monsters, and you're really looking at that era's fears. Wearing a costume, Cold War vampire films leaned into paranoia about hidden enemies living among ordinary people. Modern vampire stories often center on temptation, addiction, control. The fangs change. The fear underneath doesn't. Here's the twist most people never learn. Vlad's brutality, as extreme as it was, wasn't unusual for a 15th century ruler defending a small nation squeezed between two empires. Public execution as political theater was common practice across medieval Europe. What made Vlad different wasn't the violence. It was the story that got attached to him afterward, amplified by printing presses, then supercharged by fiction 300 years later. Historians in Romania today face something oddly personal. Vlad is still remembered there as a national defender, a ruler who protected a small, fragile country against the far larger Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, the rest of the world remembers him as a monster who drinks blood in a Gothic castle. Same man. Two completely different legacies, shaped entirely by who was telling the story and why. That's really the point, isn't it? Vlad the Impaler never needed fangs to be terrifying. His actual methods were horrifying enough on their own. But it took hundreds of years of political propaganda, printing technology, and Victorian anxiety for the world to turn a real calculating ruler into a supernatural creature that still can't die on screen. So the next time you watch a vampire movie, notice something. The cape, the castle, the accent. None of it comes from an ancient monster. It comes from a teenage hostage who learned that fear could be a form of power, and from a nervous Victorian society that needed a new way to talk about its own darkness. You've always thought the scariest part of the story was the monster. It was never the monster. It was the truth about how easily a real person becomes one. Once enough people need him to be.